Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Happy Monday to you. Hope you enjoyed your weekend. I certainly enjoyed my weekend, enjoyed my day off. Sorry for no show this past Friday, but it's good to take some time off. If you get PTO, take the PTO, take the paid time off. Don't waste it. Use it, enjoy it, do something fun with it. That's exactly what my wife and I did this past weekend. Went out to Red River Gorge in the is that technically Eastern Kentucky? I know people act like, I know I'm talking about Kentucky on an Indiana sports show, but people, when they talk about Eastern Kentucky, I don't think they're just talking about, if you'd make a line divided right down the middle, it's not just the east part of Kentucky. I feel like most people, when they reference that region, they're referring to more like, the coal mining parts of the state, like the deep eastern parts of Kentucky. So I don't know if I was technically in that part of Eastern Kentucky, but if you know where Red River Gorge is and Natural Bridge State Park, that is the vicinity in which my wife and I were in this past week. We both enjoyed it very much. In a cabin, there was still some snow on the ground for the first couple of days, and we were only there for 3. But it was nice, a little unique getaway that we both enjoyed very much. And, it was our last little trip before the baby arrives here in just 2 or 3 short months. So we're very much looking forward to that. Meanwhile, back here, I guess this happened as we arrived back in town on Sunday, Indiana men's basketball has, I almost used the phrase, put themselves back on the map. That would not be the case. But they did do something that, at least for the immediate, for this season, for their postseason chances, they did something that I don't want to say people thought was impossible, because we've seen Indiana play well against really good opponents and beat good opponents. We saw them play really well the first time they played this particular opponent, the Purdue Boilermakers, their rival. But I don't think anybody expected them to pull out the win in the manner in which they did. And what I mean by that, just in case, for those of you who may not have watched the game in its entirety, or maybe you saw them get down going into halftime and thought, you know what, this is it. Indiana is thrown in the towel. This is what always happens. The better team makes a run and they bury Indiana. If you had that mindset going into halftime, you weren't alone. I'm sure, based on what we've seen from Indiana, not just this season, but the last couple of seasons, that's kind of how things have been. But I think I was thinking about this before I started recording, if I really wanted to go down this route, because I don't want to, if it's not for sure, I guess it's not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. But I think, at least for this season, this is the first time we've seen, not only did Indiana not fold, but they punched back, and they punched harder than the other team did. And they completely buried their opponent, who had them seemingly buried. Indiana, the way they responded to being down 12 points at halftime to their rival, who has kind of turned into big brother. Let's just admit it, right? Indiana overall will always be big brother to Purdue. But if you just take what the Boilermakers have been able to do over the last few seasons, and you look at what Indiana's not been able to do, Purdue has been the better program. And I'm not going to get into the debate of which program is overall better, but some would argue that Purdue is just the better program overall in general, minus the national championships. And again, of course, the counter argument for Indiana fans is always that national championships matter more than anything. And I would agree with that. But the way that Purdue has been not only the face of the Big Ten, they're the face of the state. They're one of the best teams in the country over the last 2 to 3 years, maybe longer than that if you want to dig further. But for Indiana to take someone who has that current reputation and then completely obliterate them in the second half, plays the best defense we've seen all season long. Really had Purdue in shambles. And I know Purdue is in the midst of a losing streak. I'm trying to see, how many games has Purdue lost in a row now? That was their 4th loss in a row. And now it's been a tough stretch for Purdue. This losing streak they're on began with Michigan on the road. They lost by 2. They played Wisconsin at home, lost by 10. Went to Michigan State, lost by 9. And then now you throw in the Indiana loss, and that's the biggest loss of the 4, lost by 15. And so Purdue's definitely in a slump. That needs to be said. But Indiana is most certainly fighting for their tournament lives, for their own pride. I mean, there's a lot of guys on this team that won't be around next year, no matter who the next head coach is. There are a number of, let's just look at it real quick. Taking a look at this Indiana roster. How many of these guys will not be returning no matter what in the 2025-2026 season? Of course, you got Umar Ballo. He's I believe a 6th-year senior, if I'm not mistaken. You've got Trey Galloway, who's currently using his extra COVID season. Luke Goody will not be around. Langdon Hatton, I know he's somebody who comes off the bench and not necessarily in the most significant of minutes all of the time. He'll be gone. Malik Renew, for all intents and purposes, I mean, I know he's a junior. I guess I shouldn't be including him in this because he does still have eligibility left. And then the last one I'm forgetting is Anthony Leal. So there's a good number of players on this team that they realize they're playing their final games of college basketball. And, you know, they know they're not going to win a Big Ten tournament, but they're going to do their darndest to do whatever they can to make the most of what's left. I hate when I throw these hypotheticals out there because I always feel like I have to defend that, or at least make a disclosure statement that I'm not predicting this to happen. But there's no reason that if Indiana gets hot here down the stretch, if they win these final 4 games coming up, you've got Penn State, you have your West Coast trip with Washington and Oregon, and then you've got Ohio State. Now, winning all 4 of those, that's tough to do no matter what. Just getting on a winning streak in a tough conference is tough to do. But also asking any Indiana team in the last couple of years to go on a winning streak in any way, shape, or form, that's tough to do. Because what have we seen before from these Indiana teams? They get a big win, and then they disappoint in their very next outing. How many of us would genuinely be shocked if Indiana shows up to Simon Scott Assembly Hall on Wednesday to face Penn State, a Penn State team that when they played them the first time, we kind of thought it was a good win. Now, they did win in a very unique environment, and Penn State was in a much better place. So, yeah, it looked better back then. But this Penn State team, they're 15-13 right now, 5-12 in the Big Ten. They, at this current juncture, they will not make even the Big Ten tournament, I don't believe. So, everything I just laid out, would we really be that surprised? And I know I'm kind of being negative Nancy right now. I'm just kind of throwing out all scenarios because I believe I started off pretty positive, but we've got to play devil's advocate with ourselves a little bit, right? How surprised would we be if Indiana found a way to lose against Penn State? We wouldn't be surprised because that's the identity of this Indiana team over the last couple of years. Now, getting back to the more optimistic side of things, if Indiana can finally avoid the letdown and parlay a big win into something more, and maybe it'd be great if they can not only just beat Penn State, but beat them by whatever the spread ends up being, beat them by more than that, dominate, show the committee, the NCAA Tournament committee, that, yeah, this team has kind of been up and down all over at different points during this season, but the roster has finally come together, and we're going to show you that we're worthy of being in the NCAA Tournament because we believe we can make a run. And sorry for not making it easier on you to begin with, but we're going to show you what we're made of. And I think that could be the really fun upside of Indiana going on a run like this to end the regular season and then potentially winning a game or two in the Big Ten tournament. I think that would do you some good as well, of course. But if Indiana can go into March Madness, if they make it, of course, with that sort of momentum, anything's possible, right? I mean, I'm going to go back to NC State, and this goes back into what I was originally getting into, making a prediction that shouldn't, I'm not actually making a prediction. It's just a hypothetical, however you want to call it. But NC State was on the verge of firing their coach before they went on a run to win the ACC tournament and then make the Final Four. NC State wasn't going to sniff the NCAA tournament, and they won their conference tournament and made it to the Final Four. Does that mean that they were, does that mean that their head coach, I believe it's Kevin Keats, they're having a pretty bad year, if I'm not mistaken, once again. Does that mean he's that good of a head coach? I mean, it might mean he's good at, fixing things while they're down, but maybe he's not good at some other things to keep them consistent all season long. And same could be said for Mike Woodson. If they go on a random run, and I'm not saying follow the exact same path as NC State, but just something similar, maybe they make a weird run to the Big Ten championship game, and then they follow that up by getting to the Sweet 16 or the Elite Eight. That doesn't all of a sudden, mean that everything's going to be taken back, and Mike Woodson's going to stay head coach for the future. That's just not going to happen. And then some could argue that this is happening because there's no more pressure on Mike Woodson. This is playing with house money, as they say. And by the way, I'm drinking, I believe this is the first time in a while I've drank from this cup on the air. And I don't have my monitor in front of me. Am I actually showing this on screen? Yeah, this is my Indiana mug that I'm wearing with pride today, and one of my old Indiana shirts. I do wear Indiana shirts on this show sometime. I don't often necessarily talk about what I've got on, but I thought, just given the circumstances of what happened with Indiana and just kind of saving their season for the time being. But here's the thing. Indiana has to continue saving their season each and every game. I still stand by the fact that they need to win out the regular season. I guess there's two different ways to look at it. Let's just say they lost to Oregon but won every other game. Then you could probably make an argument that they could win a game or two in the Big Ten tournament and still get in. I'm thinking more along the Big Ten tournament doesn't matter route to get in. I think if Indiana wins out, they may still need to win a game, especially depending on who that Big Ten tournament game, that opening game is against, whoever they would be playing. So there's just a lot of different angles to look at when it comes to thinking about how Indiana can or cannot make the tournament. And I'll go ahead and say this. I think I prematurely jumped the gun, and I wasn't the only person. A lot of it was just frustration and, not being happy about the way things were going and kind of just predicting how things might go. But I kind of wrote off Indiana a bit early. Part of me doesn't. Here's the thing. I've not been tracking the bubble the same way. I mean, for example, for guys who've been around this show long enough since we started back in July, once we got into the nitty-gritty of football season, we saw where Indiana's chances were at that point. We were doing college football bracketology pretty much every week until Indiana proved that they didn't belong in that conversation. Well, we really haven't been doing college basketball bracketology at all, because once we got to that point in the season where it's time to really track seed lines and that sort of thing, Indiana, it kind of seemed like they were down and out. And so I know I'm kind of trying to pull something up here as I'm chatting here on the microphone. But and I don't believe, I was about ready to look up Mike DeCourcy's bracket forecast. I don't believe he puts out his new bracket forecasts on Tuesday. So we may take a look at his later on. Let me see if our old friend Joe Lunardi, I say old friend as if I know him. Let's see what Mr. Joe Lunardi thinks about Indiana in his current bracket, because I believe he updates his more frequently. And actually, I hate, so yeah, this will not, the updated bracketology, and I know there's people out there, if I do some further digging, but I don't want to do that while I'm actively recording. But we'll definitely take a look at some brackets on Wednesday, just to kind of see where Indiana currently stands, because I'm sure we'll see some updates from both of these guys between now and then. But right now, if I look at what they have for Indiana, I guess we can kind of see where they had them previously, and then see where that would move them. I guess I'm looking at Joe Lunardi's, and we'll do this one and then move on. But going into the weekend, Indiana was in Joe Lunardi's next four out. I would say that a win against Purdue could jump you up at least to the last four in. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And so if Indiana does happen to be in in some different bracketologies. I'm sure there'll be some that leave them out and some that don't. I mean, Indiana's more on the bubble than I think we just get so caught up in Indiana not meeting expectations sometimes that we don't realize, like, hey, like they can still get in. And I know getting in isn't the standard for Indiana basketball, but at least at this point, now that we know that new things are coming next fall, I mean, can we at least enjoy what's left of this season, especially now that Indiana got the win. They've now got two really great marquee victories on their schedule in the latter half of the season when it really matters. You beat Michigan State on the road, and you beat Purdue, your arch rival, and gets Mike Woodson to 500, I believe, again against the Boilermakers as well. A little tidbit there. And not only that, but the bubble has been so weak this season. It makes you wonder, like, in a more competitive year, would Indiana be on that sort of bubble? I think maybe that's kind of our line of thinking as well, where if teams were just better, and not having so many mediocre teams or even less than mediocre, maybe Indiana wouldn't be in this position. And then I'm not going to get into this, but that also goes into back to the argument that I was talking about last week. Why expand the NCAA tournament? If there's so many blah teams on the bubble, like what does expanding do for the product? It does nothing. It does nothing for how good the basketball is. It does something for the TV markets, as it always would. The TV markets would put every team in the NCAA tournament if they could. And it would be like that commercial that they came out with, I guess it was maybe 5 to 10 years ago, where you see the little mascot and the "we're in" sign, and it's, they were 0-31 on the season or something ridiculous like that. Or maybe they got one win, something very silly. So yeah, Indiana being on the bubble, it's fun. I guess they've been on the bubble for it's seemingly the last 4 seasons, and so it would be nice for them to not be on the bubble. I remember, and this is not even really worth digging into too much either, but I remember back in sort of I don't want to say the infancy of my Indiana basketball fandom, but back whenever the early years of Tom Crean, Indiana was not good enough to be in the tournament at all. And then they jumped into being really good, to where they were always in the tournament. They were either in the tournament handily or they missed it. I remember saying, man, it'd be interesting to see what it would be like being a fan with the team on the bubble. And now that's all we've gotten the last 4 years. So either way, that's where Indiana's at. And they'll face Penn State on Wednesday. And will they if they lose their, I hate to say they're done, because I feel like I've gone back and forth with that all year long. But they definitely will have work to do in the Big Ten tournament if they lose any more games. It doesn't matter if it's to Penn State, Washington, Oregon, Ohio State. And honestly, you have maybe one loss left in you. And you really shouldn't have any. We'll cross that bridge whenever we get there, because I feel like I'm teetering on wanting to go down that path or not. So we'll just do that a bit later. All right, real quick, I want to get into one other thing and just kind of, I probably should have played this, or I think I might have even already exited out of it now. I was going to play part of the sound as I was going to talk about Mike Woodson getting to sit on the exact chair that Bob Knight threw across the court during his infamous chair throwing. First of all, I think that entire thing is pretty cool. Whether that's the real chair or not, very cool that they had something like that. I believe it was the real chair. And I think Mike Woodson maybe even spoken about it after the game. I think there's a quote out there mentioning that there was a coach for a different athletic program that took it and held on to it. I guess they just knew that would be something worth keeping around for, moments like this, the 40th anniversary of the chair throwing. It's just pretty, again, I like seeing all of this good stuff for Mike Woodson at the very end of his tenure because, there was so much nastiness and negativity less than a month ago. And I don't think I was ever nasty, but I definitely shared my displeasure with where things were going. And for him to be able to graciously exit the way that he's going to leave. And I know the season's not done. If they lose their next 4 games, something like that, people will not be happy. But to kind of bookend, like if we're talking Mike Woodson moments that are things people will remember about his tenure, I think the things people will remember most, maybe I'm wrong about this, will be the way that he didn't have Purdue's number, but he got the monkey off of Indiana's back in his first season. He helped eliminate, I think it was a 9-game losing streak Indiana had to Purdue, something outrageous like that. That was the first big moment. And as of right now, this is his final big moment, having that last win against Purdue at home, as things are kind of coming to a close for you on your head coaching career. And of course, not the same style of win, and also not the same circumstances. But to bookend your tenure with memorable wins over your rival, that has to be a good thing, especially for somebody who is, of course, an alum of Indiana University, and was, one of the better players to ever put on an Indiana Hoosiers men's basketball uniform. So, all right, before we get into our next major topic of discussion, if you will, and I say major, it's not like I'm about ready to break some news or anything, but I do want to go ahead and shout out the programs that don't get nearly as much attention from this show and likely many other shows as well. But Indiana women's basketball, quick update with them. They, in the last, since we last spoke, which was Wednesday of last week, they defeated Ohio State, number 8 Ohio State, on Thursday, 71-61. Of course, good for their NCAA tournament chances. Then they unfortunately fouled that up. Again, it was a road loss against another top 25 opponent in number 22 Michigan State, but they lost that game 73-65. They will be back in action this Thursday against Maryland, and then they will end their season in West Lafayette against Purdue. Excuse me. So we'll continue to follow along with that and see where they end up landing when it comes to the postseason. Also, baseball and softball. Last time we had talked, baseball had not gotten off to a strong start, got completely swept in their opening invitational, the Sanderson Ford College Baseball Classic. And then their midweek game against, I don't remember who it was. It was IPFW, Fort Wayne, if I'm not mistaken. That game got canceled, was supposed to be the home opener at Bart Kaufman Field. And then they were in Cary and are still currently in Cary, North Carolina. I don't know if this tournament has a name. But they defeated Fordham 15-2. They defeated Harvard 14-4, and they are currently playing Northwestern in a non-conference matchup. Very odd, as I've mentioned previously. And I'm trying to see if the score has updated since I last checked. It was and again, I don't even know why I'm reading the score, because by the time this releases, likely around 2:00-ish, this game may be even over by then. So, but as of the time of this recording, it's the bottom of the 6th. Northwestern currently has a 2-1 lead over the Indiana Hoosiers. And then baseball will be back on Wednesday for what is now their home opener against the Xavier Musketeers. You can check that out on Big Ten Plus if you're a baseball fiend. And then quick shout out. I haven't mentioned Indiana softball at all, and they're off to a much better start than the baseball program. They are 10-3. All their wins coming on a neutral field. Unfortunately, 0-3 in road matchups. They have not played a home game yet. Just a quick shout out here. Here's their wins on the season. They 10-0'd Stony Brook in 5 innings. They defeated Iowa State 9-1 in 5 innings. They defeated Stony Brook again 10-1 in 6 innings. They also, again, Iowa State once again 7-5. I guess it was a round robin. Played each other twice. They did lose their opener to Miami, or to FIU in Miami, 4-3. And then in the Puerto Vallarta Challenge, they 10-0'd North Dakota State 10-0, or 10-0'd North Dakota State in 5 innings. Defeated Illinois State 6-5, defeated Boise State 10-4, and then shut out BYU 3-0. Also defeated UIC in the Janine McCaney Memorial Classic 7-4. UTEP won that game 12-2 in 5 innings. I mean, a lot of run rulings going on here. They unfortunately got shut out in a run rule situation against number 12 Texas Tech most recently, 8-0, and then in their second matchup, not quite as good either, lost 2-7. But overall, great start to the Indiana women's softball program. They've had some pretty good seasons over the last couple of years, if I'm not mistaken. So good on them. Their next line of action will be in the Tiger Invitational in Clemson. That'll be this weekend. They won't play their first home game until March 7th, the Hoosier Classic at Andy Moore Field. They'll take on IU Indy actually, it'll be a doubleheader that day. They'll also play Bowling Green State, or Bowling Green for you purists. Bowling Green State, the purest way in saying it. I'm not too sure. But yeah, they'll have their first homestand beginning in early March. And then we're not too far. We're knocking on the door to spring, baby. And for those of you who have winter weather fatigue, I'm sure you're very excited about that. I don't necessarily have winter weather fatigue, but I am ready for spring at this point. Spring is without a doubt. Spring and fall are my favorite times of the year. There's something about the change in seasons, with the harsher seasons in particular. And this is something that doesn't necessarily matter, but I was thinking about this the other day, and I figure now that I'm talking about it, why not share it here? If we're ranking the seasons, right, 1 and 2, they're interchangeable, but they're both very high up above the other two, and it's spring and fall. You can interchange which two are the best depending on your preference for what's going on that time of year. Of course, if you're a football person, you might like the fall more. If you hate winter so much that you just need spring, then maybe you like spring more. I don't know. But those two with the milder temperatures, you can't deny how great they are, I feel like. And I hate summer. I hate the heat that comes with summer. I hate to say I hate summer because I do like going on trips, vacation to the beach, whatever, that sort of thing. I do like all that. But by the time we get to July and we've had a few weeks of 90-degree temperatures, I'm sick of it. And I'm sure many of you, for those who have been around long enough, remember I was fiending for fall and for football stuff going on. And I think that's why I tend to lean towards fall over spring a little bit more, just because I get that summer fatigue as opposed to the winter fatigue. Because also in summer, unless you're a baseball guy, like a Major League Baseball guy, there's not really a lot of good sports to consume. And I've never been, it's tough for me to follow Major League Baseball just because there's just so many games. It feels kind of with the NBA, like the NBA and I don't want to speak for Major League Baseball because I'm not an MLB purist. I'm more of a basketball guy and a football guy, of course. But the NBA would benefit from playing less games, at least when it comes to the overall product. They'd also benefit, this is for every sport, they benefit from not being able to tank. That's nonsense. Being able to suck and get the first team in the draft by sucking on purpose, that's a conversation for another day. But either way, those were that was a long-winded way in getting back to that. Those were our non-rev shout-outs. I got to get a better name than calling them non-revenue shout-outs. It gets the point across. It's shout-outs for the sports that are of non-revenue. They do not bring money into the athletics department the way that the big name programs do, but it's just kind of degrading. I'm not trying to make it that way. I just feel like there's a better way that I could phrase it. And I tried doing that at the beginning, I feel like, but maybe I didn't do that good of a job of it, considering I went back to calling it non-revenue. So maybe we'll workshop something else for that. All right, quick coffee break so I don't have to pause this recording. And then we'll get into one other topic for today, and then we'll wrap this thing up here on a Monday. All right, let's get into it. We're going to go into a little more Indiana football, and I want to comment on. I was reading through this article by our one and only Dylan Traeger on HoosierIllustrated.com earlier. I believe he was in attendance for Curt Cignetti's. What was the name of this? It was basically a question and answer session in front of some Indiana students. And there were a couple of things of interest that Indiana fans will be, I think, interested to hear about. And of course, everybody I feel like wonders, like, why, maybe they don't wonder it, but there was a point where nobody would ever expect an Indiana football coach to stick around after having a really good season, especially a season that Curt Cignetti had, where you start off the season 10-0, you win 11 regular season games, you get to the first ever 12-team college football playoff as a 10 seed, and you beat the doors off of everybody that you play except for really Michigan. And then your two losses, who ended up being against the two opponents that would play each other in the national championship game. Again, there's that mention right there. That's something that I feel like Indiana football fans are always going to bring up. It's not quite like Watt shot level annoying, but maybe it will get to that. Maybe I'll make it that level of annoying for certain people, because it's definitely one of those things that it's just kind of funny right now. Maybe it'll eventually be cliche, especially as more seasons go on. But it's always funny to bring up to people because Indiana went through so much slander this past season about, oh, their schedule sucks. They didn't play nobody. And they didn't play the best of teams. I'm not trying to say they had a hard schedule, but they definitely didn't play an easy schedule. And they destroyed everybody. Anyway, I'm turning this into something that it wasn't meant to be. But Cignetti, when he was speaking with the students at this event that he was at in Bloomington, there's a couple of quotes that I'm going to mention here that I think are worth, of course, Dylan he thought were worth putting in this article that I'll mention here and elaborate on as well. But here's the first one. He said to some students, there wasn't any job in the nation worth taking once we were 10-0. Now, I don't know if that means that like that was a threshold. Like if I can get to 10-0, then, this is, I don't need to, if I can get to 10-0 here, I should say, then there's no reason I need to look elsewhere, because if I can do this here, especially in year one, I should be able to replicate this any other season. And maybe that's not exactly what he was thinking. Or maybe what it was, because when you got that 10th win, it was, of course, against Michigan. It was the only win Indiana had that was a one-score game. 20-15 was the final score. And it was a game where Indiana kind of had their back against the wall. Like they were playing with the lead, but this was the time of the season where Michigan was really kind of figuring themselves out, right? If you remember that. They just came off beating the doors off of Northwestern, and they were kind of just playing for momentum going into the offseason at that point, right? And as we all know, they followed that game up by beating Ohio State, eventual national champions, and then beating Alabama, Kalen DeBoer's Alabama, was it the ReliaQuest Bowl, if I'm not mistaken? And I know people said the bowl games don't matter, but hey, if it don't matter to Michigan, don't matter to Alabama. Somebody had to win that game, right? You still fielded some players. Anyway, besides the point. What it might have been for Cignetti is, if you remember, after Indiana defeated Michigan in that game, the post-game interview on the field, I believe CBS was doing the broadcast that day, and Jenny Dell was on the field interviewing Cignetti, and it was the first time that he really kind of got choked up whenever he was talking after the game. He was talking about how the fans have been incredible, but there was a point where he was like, this is over the top. And you could tell like that was the moment where like he was living in a dream for himself. Like you could tell that he could have never envisioned what was happening to happen. And I bet it wouldn't matter where he was at. I'm sure he knew that he was going to try his darndest to make this Indiana football team as good as it was. But I don't think that he ever thought it was possible to get the support that he got to make a college football playoff. Maybe I'm wrong about both of those things. I mean, he said when and they'll come, and he was right about that. So, but maybe he's just, until you see it all happen, right? It's one of those things where it can't be easy to envision the way that it will look like, especially when you're a place like Indiana and you don't really have anything to reference. Like this is, and I've said this before, unless you want to go back and throw the Rose Bowl season in there, again, under different types of circumstances. Outside of that, this was, I should say, the single greatest season in Indiana football history. And I think we all enjoyed the ride for what it was, but I think we'll look back on it even more fondly, especially depending on how things shape up over the next couple of years. Maybe this will just be one of many. Who knows? And then we'll look back at the entire Kurt Cignetti era as something. I think we'll look back on it fondly anyway. I don't see this thing taking too many steps back. But to strike gold the way that Indiana football did in year one, I'm not saying it can't be replicated, because I do think that when you return as much as you're returning, especially on the coaching staff, I mean, everybody's back minus one assistant, Tino Sinceri. Your two, I mean, the biggest pieces, of course, Mike Shanahan and Brian Haynes. And then you have a lot of great weapons on offense and defense. You are going to have to replace some, of course, Curtis Rourke being the name that everybody will think about. How good will Fernando Mendoza be? I think a lot of people have high expectations for him. But Curtis Rourke, somebody who will be probably at the top of the Mount Rushmore of Indiana quarterbacks, right? I mean, the offense set so many records last year. And then we found out at the end of the season that he played the entire year with a torn ACL. I don't even know how that's possible. There was part of me, whenever I remember reading that said, like, are they making this up just to make it look more impressive, all of the things he was able to do? Because that's something that, by the way, I don't think they were making it up, but that's an injury that what probably would have happened was, since he played the entire year, like, he kept going because Indiana was playing for something. If it ever got to a point where Indiana's season was failing, we probably would have seen Curtis Rourke just sit, right? They would have, maybe, again, I'm just putting myself in the shoes of the football team and the PR people, how they would have handled it. I'm assuming they would have eventually came up with a reason to say, oh, Curtis Rourke tore his ACL in practice, he's going to sit the rest of the year. That probably would have eventually came out if Indiana had not had the year that they had. Maybe I'm totally wrong about that. I don't want to sit there and say that that's what would have happened, but why else would you play an entire year with a torn ACL, especially when you're trying to and maybe that's part of it too. You're trying to get to the NFL. Maybe as long as you can play through it, then you're fine. It'll eventually heal on its own. I don't know. Someone tell me in the comments if you're aware of any other quarterback or player that's ever played a full season or a significant amount of time with a torn ACL. But I think talking through it has made me just kind of realize how insane it actually is that he was able to pull off something like that. But yeah, they'll have to replace him. They'll have to replace a number of defenders, but a lot of guys that are impact guys on defense coming back. Aiden Fisher, Mikhail Kamara, D'Angelo Pons. I mean, those are three of the most important names on your defense, all playing different positions. You got Kamara as a lineman. You got Fisher as a linebacker, and then Pons as a corner. I mean, those are all three important sides to your defense that, as long as you build complementary pieces around them, you need to have a good D-line in general. I don't know how much of the D-line is coming back, save for Kamara. But if you can handle that, I mean, you can pick up where you left off, so to speak. And, with those first three games in the non-conference being against Old Dominion, Kennesaw State, Indiana State, we all know that 3-0 is expected at this point. Like, it's to the point to where if Indiana were to find a way to lose any of those three games, you'd have people immediately going, okay, last year was just a flash in the pan. We're back to same old Indiana. So hopefully that ends up not happening. I'm not betting on that happening, of course. But Indiana should get to 3-0. And then what I think, if you remember my conversation with Jeffrey the Greek, that game against Illinois in week 4, I don't know if Indiana has a bye before then or not. I don't think they do. I think their first bye week comes. We're not talking bye weeks right now. But whenever they face Illinois, their first conference game at home as well. Illinois has big aspirations for this upcoming season as well. I think the winner of that particular game will more than likely springboard into the potential. I mean, maybe for Illinois, maybe I should hesitate what I'm saying here, because that actually for Indiana begins the most significant toughest stretch of games. I mean, Indiana could start off 3-0 and then potentially lose their next 3 games. And I know that sounds horrible when you think about, Like, oh my gosh, you go from 11-1 to 3-3. But that's kind of your 3 toughest games. Well, say for maybe Penn State. Yeah, Penn State would be above. I would put above maybe all 3 of those, if we're being honest. Illinois, Iowa, Oregon in back-to-back games. And then you have a bye between Iowa and Oregon. That's where the bye week is. Those 3 games will be difficult to go 3-0 in. I do think, given Cignetti's track record, I do think they'll find a way to win some of those at the very least, if not all of them. They'll most certainly be underdogs against Oregon. I don't know how good Iowa is going to be next year. I know they brought in a really hyped up transfer quarterback. I don't remember exactly where he's from. Might have been at the FCS level, one of the highest FCS performers of last season. And Iowa hasn't had, a stellar offense in quite some time. And so if they're able to figure that out, it could be a very, defensive dogfight in Kinnick Stadium. And hopefully Iowa doesn't take the sails out of Indiana's, or take the wind out of Indiana's sails this time around the way that they did in 2021 when, they removed the train from the tracks. Like the train didn't even derail. Kirk Ferentz and everybody involved with the Iowa program took what was going on with Indiana and just picked them up, and King Kong threw them off and said, you know what, you don't belong here. And Indiana didn't belong from 2021 all the way until this past season in 2024. So that'll be a very interesting sequence. It's going to be if Indiana gets to 3-0, and then let's just assume you knock off Illinois, those next 2 games at Iowa and at Oregon will more than likely determine whether or not you are going to be in the running for another college football playoff appearance. Because we know you can handle a loss, especially when you have Penn State on the schedule. If you're Indiana, especially now that you've built up the goodwill that you have, and you go 10-2, you're probably on the edge of being in the top. It depends on where you get. It all depends on rankings and that sort of thing. But 10-2 is probably what you can be and squeak by and get in the playoff, right? And then 11-1, you're most certainly in nowadays. And then we all know anything above that is not even worth judging the whether or not you would get in type conversation. So we'll see. And again, I can't rule out that Indiana may find ways to lose against rival Michigan State. And I know Michigan State's not really a rival, but it's a trophy game for the old brass spittoon. They'll be back in Bloomington. You'll have UCLA coming to Bloomington against Tino Sinceri's offense. Who knows how good he will turn around the Bruins football offense. But that'll be something interesting to keep an eye on, because if he brings a high-flying offense into Bloomington, we may get a shootout, and that could be a very pivotal moment for, both Cignetti and Sinceri, of course, in their respective seasons. Maryland on the road, that's always kind of a funky environment. Penn State, I hate that Tom Allen won't be there to kind of have that storyline to talk about, but either way, it'll still be an intriguing match. You got it in November. If Indiana's really good, that could be a whiteout game for Penn State. I don't know what else they've got on their schedule, but that's something that could be, a crazy environment for Indiana. And then you'll round out the year with Wisconsin at home and Purdue on the road. And Wisconsin used to be an intimidating opponent. Of course, that was back when Brett Bielema was the head coach there. I feel like those were like the really crazy Wisconsin teams that, Running Back University and Monte Ball, Jonathan Taylor, and I'm sure there's some other I'm not thinking off the top of my head. Yeah, there's Braylon Allen. I believe he was another one. Wisconsin had a really crazy stable of running backs, as did Indiana back when Kevin Wilson was around. But it'll be interesting to see how good Wisconsin ends up being. And then Purdue on the road with Barry Odom. I doubt they will be as big of pushovers as they were this past season, but will they be at the same competitive level as you would expect a decent Purdue team to be? Who knows? All of that remains to be seen. So with that being said, let's go ahead and wrap up today's show. I know no guests today. Also, I know today's show got released quite a bit later. Say quite a bit. It's only about an hour or so later than usual. But apologies for those who like the early shows. That'll happen from time to time. This will also happen from time to time. Nonetheless, I appreciate you as always. Be sure to comment on this YouTube video and any YouTube video that you'd like. I'll read them on the air, read your comments on the air, no matter what it is. I don't read every comment, but I will look through and evaluate every comment and decide what I want to talk about sometimes. That's how I should, I guess, preface it. Feel free to leave a comment. We'll chat about things on the next show, and we'll dive into some bracketology when they update that here over the next couple of days. And we'll talk about some other things as well. So until then, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.